Angry at her inability to fit the shapes through the holes, Rachel slammed the toy into the floor, pouting and crossing her arms. "It's a stupid little kid toy anyway," she huffed. "Rachel, what's the matter, sweetie? Why the frowny face?" They turned to see Pam had returned and seen Rachel's disgust with the toy. She knelt beside them and ran a hand through Rachel's hair. The girl grimaced and pulled away. She didn't like being petted like some kitty. Pam drew back and frowned at the fussy girl. "Are you feeling okay, Rachel? Does your tummy ache? Do you have an OE?" she prodded in a sing-song voice. "No." Rachel snapped back. "Just leave me alone. Now, Rachel, we don't talk to grown-ups like that. Be a good girl and use your inside voice." Rachel seethed but kept her mouth shut. Well, you'll be feeling better soon, honey. We're going to have some real fun now," she promised. While Rachel sat fuming, Pam and another carer fetched a large rolled-up sheet. They spread it across the carpet in the middle of the room until it covered half the space. The other carer then brought in a bundle of white garments. The duo watched as Pam and the other woman began slipping smocks over children's heads, covering up their clothing. Baggy armholes left their hands free. Rachel watched Brian accept his smock willingly and decided not to put up a fight as Pam threaded the girl's arms through the appropriate holes. She even bit her lip and stayed silent as the woman slipped her socks off so that pretty princess socks wouldn't get messy. The reason for their new wardrobes was soon revealed. Pam and her colleague brought in several painters' buckets filled with various colors of paint. They also had large sheets of paper for each child. They set these down in the middle of the protective sheet and then clapped their hands to get everyone's attention. "Okay, children, we're going to do something really fun today," Pam announced. "It's time for finger painting." Several young men and women screeched happily and clapped their hands. Meggie could be seen hopping on her bum in excitement. Rachel groaned. The last thing she wanted was to get all messy. She hated being dirty and now she was going to be forced to actually dip her hands in icky paint. Rachel sat resolutely still while the others crept and toddled over to the paint buckets. Brian shrugged and made his way over as well, leaving Rachel alone. Soon the kids were all quite messy. Bright purple, red, green and yellow paint were everywhere, splashed across the sheet, rubbed all over the smocks, on face and in hair. The marine-built man had moved beyond finger painting, dipping his feet into the green bucket and slapping his bare soles back and forth on his canvas to create lots of green footprints. To Rachel's dismay, even Brian seemed to quickly get absorbed in the game. He had yellow handprints all over the front of his smock, green paint smeared across a cheek, his toes covered in blue, yet he was smiling. "Come on, Rachel, don't you want to have fun?" Pam called from the middle of it. "I'm fine," Rachel replied. Pam didn't take no for an answer though. She headed over to the college girl and took her hand. "You can't just sit there like a bump on the log, silly goose. Now let's make some pretty pictures for your mommy. You don't want your mommy to be the only one without a pretty picture, do you?" "I don't want to," Rachel whined, trying to stay put but failing. Somehow the woman seemed exceedingly stronger than Rachel even though she was the same height. "Don't be silly, you'll have lots of fun." "I don't wanna get messy," Rachel insisted. "It'll all wash out, Rachel, I promise. Just have some fun. Look how much Brian is enjoying it." Rachel grunted with disdain as Pam sat her down in the middle of the gaggle of screeching messy toddlers. A fleck of purple splashed across her cheek and she recoiled as if slapped. But Pam still had her hand and she was pulling it down to a bucket of yellow paint. She couldn't resist as she felt her hand dip into the smooth, cool liquid. It wasn't as viscous as house paint, it was more gelled, less likely to splash all over or drip into sensitive eyes. She felt it squish between her fingers, across her palms. Pam lifted her hand out of the bucket and guided it to a blank sheet of paper, placing it down and then lifting so she'd made a handprint. Rachel looked down at the results. There was no picture to paint, of course, no design to follow. It was a simple sensory exercise for small children. And yet it felt so nice. Far from feeling dirty and sullied, the paint on her hand squished delightfully as she flexed her fingers. Rachel looked around at the other colors. They were all familiar, but their names escaped her, much as with the shapes. One triggered a memory though, and so she dipped her clean hand into a bucket of blue, then rubbed her two hands together. Aside from the pleasant squishing sensation, she was delighted to find that both her hands were now a brand new color, green. "I made a new color," she announced out loud. "Very good, dear," Pam praised. Rachel giggled to herself and placed her hands back on the canvas, smearing them about. Her skin seemed super sensitive now, nerves lighting up with pleasure as she dipped her hands back in more paint and smeared it more. Feeling mischievous at getting so messy, she leant over and rubbed brown paint all over the back of another child's smock. Then she felt foreign hands on her bare arm. She turned to find Meggie smiling wickedly as she coated the arm in pink paint. Rachel had to get her back. So she wiped her now purple hand on Meggie's cheek. A finger paint war had begun. It was only 15 minutes later as one carer removed the paint buckets and Pam led the children outside to get cleaned up that Rachel became aware of what a fool she looked like. She was covered in finger paint. It was in her hair, across her cheeks, down her arms and all over her smock. To her chagrin, she saw that Pam was right to take her socks off, as paint was even squishing between her toes. Pam was right, little kids here were better off barefoot, and that clearly included Rachel herself. In fact, as they stood to head outside, she saw that even Brian wasn't as messy as her. Somehow clean, mature Rachel had ended up among the dirtiest of these overgrown tots. She wished she could escape to the bathroom so Pam and Brian wouldn't see how far she'd fallen. It was bad enough when Meggie gave her that goofy idiotic grin and declared, "All methy." Outside, Pam was stripping the children out of their smocks after washing the paint off them with a garden hose. Rachel stood in line sulking and trying not to make eye contact with Brian while Pam washed Timmy's buzz-cut hair clean of the green paint he'd gotten in it. When she lifted his smock off though, Timmy started to grab at the crotch of his visible pull-ups, knees bending inwards. "Timmy got a potty," he announced loudly. "Oh, okay, just hold it in for me like a big boy and Miss Corley will be right out to take you to the potty. Can you hold it like a big boy for me?" Timmy nodded and moved to the side as Pam took the next girl to be cleaned. But behind her back, Timmy toddled away across the small backyard to a bush that sat in the middle of the grass. There he inserted a finger in either side of his pull-ups and yanked them down to his ankles. Rachel watched in disgust as he proceeded to pee-pee on the bush. When he was done, he simply kicked his feet free of the pull-up and turned around, ambling happily across the lawn towards them with his equipment dangling out for all to see. "Oh my gosh," Rachel gasped. The marine-built young man skipped along the grass, his wee-wee swinging and bobbing about freely without a hint of shame. Soon he was back next to Pam and eagerly tugging at her sleeve. "When potty," he told her happily, his free hand playing idly with his former manhood. Pam looked down at his nudity and chuckled. "Looks like we have a little streaker here," she joked. "So you went potty, did you?" Timmy nodded emphatically. "Where'd you do that, hon?" "Dear," Timmy announced, pointing to the bush. "Honey, that's good that you didn't use your pull-up, but big boys use the potty chair. Can you try and wait till you're on the chair next time?" "For me, honey." Timmy nodded solemnly now. "Okay, now where are your big boy pants, ya little jaybird?" Timmy pointed wordlessly at the bush again. "Well, go get 'em if you're a big boy." Timmy hurried across the grass again, bending over and picking up the pull-ups with both hands, and giving everyone a look at his big bare bottom. Then he returned and handed them to Pam, who praised him for keeping them dry and then helped the 6-foot-tall half-naked man slip them back onto his legs and up to cover his privates again. Rachel was aghast at the whole scene, but it only got worse when Timmy skipped back into the house. Pam then turned to her and said, "Okay Rachel, your turn." Rachel cringed as the woman looked her over and clucked her tongue. "My oh my, it looks like someone had fun after all." Pam declared. Rachel kept her eyes on the ground as the woman took her hand and began to scrub it clean. The cold water of the garden hose poured over her arms and then her head while Pam cleaned her. "My, what a messy girl you are, Rachel," she exclaimed more than once. It was all too much for the woman and she began to cry in earnest. Tears streamed down her blushing cheeks. She could taste their saltiness as they reached her lips. Pam heard the girl sobbing and stopped scrubbing for a moment, kneeling to look into Rachel's eyes. "Oh Rachel, don't cry, sweetie. I was just teasing, dear. You're not a dirty girl. You just got messy playing, like you're supposed to. It's your job as a little girl to get messy and my job to clean you up." Rachel only cried all the more at being reminded of her new station in life. Pam brushed her cheek and shushed her quietly. "Come on, Rachel, no more crocodile tears. When you're all cleaned up, I'll give you a big snuggle." That idea was humiliating and appealing at the same time. She didn't want to be hugged and fawned over by another adult woman, but at the same time the need to be held and cuddled was very strong. She wanted to feel safe and warm and comforted. Rachel's adult side won out in the end and she pulled herself free as soon as she was clean, hurrying back into the toddler playroom. There she collapsed to her knees and cried into her hands until she felt an arm wrap over her shoulder. Brian was at her side now, pulling her close so she could weep onto his shoulder. "I know, Rach, I know it sucks. I got so messy," she whimpered. "Me too. I couldn't help it. Once I started playing." "You couldn't stop," Rachel finished his sentence. He nodded. The sliding door to the backyard slammed shut and Pam strode to the middle of the room. "Okay everyone, it's potty time. Let's get all you big boys and girls on your potties so you can make your wees and poos." With that she went over to the door at the other side of the room and gestured for the kids to follow. "Come on Rach, we gotta do it," Brian told her, pulling her to a standing position. "Not all at once," Rachel disagreed. I can't control mine anymore, Rach. I don't wanna go pee-pee in my pull-ups in front of everyone. I gotta use the potty just in case." Rachel nodded and followed Brian into the line. The room they entered was not a bathroom though. It was a plain white-walled room with a linoleum floor and a dozen oversized potty seats placed in a circle. They weren't all identical. A couple looked almost like real toilets aside from being made of plastic and having bright primary color designs. Others were simple big red buckets with yellow seats and a few had backs for kids to lean back against while sat on them. One by one Pam pulled down shorts and skirts, hiked up dresses and yanked down pull-ups to seat the kids on the potties. None of the young men or women seemed any more bothered than Timmy had when their privates were exposed to the group. They twisted back and forth distractedly as Pam set their adult-sized forms on the big potty chairs, tucking penises behind guards and warning them to stay put till they'd made their pee-pees and poo-piss. She reached Brian, undoing the buckles on his shortals and letting them drop to his ankles, then slipping his pull-ups down too. Unlike any of the other boys, he immediately covered his weenie, making Pam snigger at his modesty. He also insisted on slipping his own pee-pee behind the guard, trying not to think about all the people watching him sitting here. Rachel didn't go so easily. It didn't matter that the other kids were too busy picking their noses and twiddling their toes to be staring at her. She was not about to be stripped half naked before a dozen of her former friends and classmates. When Pam approached, she stepped back and shook her head. "No, I don't have to go right now. I'll tell you when I need to pee-pee. Honey, you know the rules. All children have to sit on the potty before nap time. You don't want to have an accident and end up back in diapers like a little baby, do you?" "I won't have an accident. I just don't want to go in front of everyone." "You've got nothing to hide, sweetie. Just be a good girl and you can have a treat after nap." "So do you use a toilet with in front of all the other women here?" "There are different rules for grown-ups, sweetie, you'll understand when you're older." Rachel shook her head again and this time the carer moved towards her quickly, ready to force her. Brian couldn't sit by and watch his friend be manhandled, so he stood quickly and started to move towards them, hindered by the clothing around his ankles. He'd only made it a step when he felt warm liquid splash across his knees. He felt dizzy with shame. He was making tinkles all over the floor and his bunched-up shortles, a golden steam of wee spurting from his dangling weenie. He froze in horror. "Brian! You need to stay on the potty, dear," Pam called out, forgetting Rachel as she rushed over and put her hands on the boy's shoulders, guiding him back onto the potty. Brian was still too embarrassed to speak as he felt the carer's cool fingers grasp his penis and push it below the splash guard. The sound of pee splashing on the plastic filled the room, but it was too late to save his pride. Several of the other children were smiling and giggling as they fidgeted on their potties. Pam had her hands on her hips and was shaking her head back and forth. "Brian, look at the mess you've made," she chided, gesturing to the yellow puddle on the linoleum floor. "Sorry," he mumbled. "It's okay, dear, learning the potty isn't easy. You just need to remember to stay put if you feel the urge to tinkle. Now you've gotten your nice outfit all dirty," she said, crouching and drawing the soaked shortles off his feet. "I'll get you a new pair of big boy pants, but these will have to dry out for a bit," she remarked, carrying them away. As Pam left the room, Rachel thought she'd actually escaped for once. She did feel truly awful for Brian, but at least she'd been spared. Or so she thought. Then the sound of several grown men and women tinkling loudly in their potties began to affect her. The urge to pee hit suddenly and violently. Rachel grabbed her crotch and crossed her legs sharply, seized by the need to empty her bladder. "Oh no," she shrieked, waddling cross-legged to the one empty potty seat. She didn't want to do it, but the alternative was far worse. So she hiked up her dress and pulled her big girl pants down, plopping her bare bottom on the plastic seat and letting go. She sighed with relief at having made it, glancing over at the shaggy-haired boy of about 20 seated beside her. He was staring at her blankly, picking his nose with one hand and playing with himself with the other. She refused to become his equal. Whatever she had to do, she would remember that she was better than these dumb brats. Upon returning, Pam hadn't said anything to Rachel, but she had given her a knowing smile. Then the children were stood up one by one so the carer could clean them. In most cases this consisted of Pam dabbing the ends of pee-pees and wiping privates clean, then pulling the pull-ups back up. But when she stood the boy next to Rachel, it revealed his smelly, poopy bottom. Rachel gagged and very nearly threw up as the carer led the boy to the wall and had him spread his legs so she could wipe his bum clean. Rather than wait, Rachel stood and yanked her pull-ups back on, rushing out of the potty room. It was nap time next, and Brian, now clothed in just his t-shirt and pull-ups, settled on a mat beside Rachel, facing her. "You okay?" she managed to ask. "I guess. You?" She shrugged. "Want a hug?" Brian asked, sounding timid. Rachel couldn't resist the urge anymore. She nodded. Brian wrapped his arms around the girl and the two cuddled close. "It's not a boyfriend-girlfriend thing, you know," Brian whispered to her. I need this. I know, you wanna feel safe and warm. I feel it too. I can't fight it. I want my mommy," Rachel told him. "Me too," he admitted, feeling drowsy as the lullaby Pam had put on helped the kids drift off to sleep. Soon he and Rachel were both peacefully asleep in each other's arms. "Home again. Oh, that is just too cute," Sarah declared, looking down at her son and his friend napping cuddled together. His mommy's voice roused Brian from his slumber just as the lullaby tape clicked off. He blinked his eyes open, looking into Rachel's still sleeping face. He stretched his arms as the lights flicked back on in the room. It was then that he noticed his mommy was actually standing right there above them. He jerked onto his back and away from Rachel in surprise. It was like his mommy had walked in on him while he had a girl over in his dorm room. "Well, hello there, sleepyhead, did you have a nice cuddle with your friend?" she asked him cheerily. Brian didn't know what to say, so he just nodded slowly. Rachel came to at this point and felt a little weird to wake up with this woman standing over her. Meanwhile, Brian noticed the bunched-up shortles over his mommy's arm and he knew that she knew what he'd done. His eyes lowered to the floor and he crossed his legs to make their bareness less obvious. Sarah didn't comment on her son's accident though, she had other things on her mind. "We're going back to your friend Meg's house for a play date today, Brian. Isn't that nice?" Not waiting for a response, she continued, "And your friend Rachel is coming too. Her mommy asked me to watch her while she takes Danny to the dentist." Inside, Brian was actually overjoyed at this news. Since the book wasn't at his place nor Rachel's, that meant Meg's was where it had to be. This could be their best chance to fix things. Rachel, on the other hand, was quite nervous. She'd seen what had happened to Megan. Going to the house where it likely happened was not her idea of a good plan. But she had no say in the matter, and so a few minutes later they were all piled in Sarah's car headed to Megan's house. As they drove through the streets, Meggie seemed to be having a lovely time watching the world go by. She pointed out the window time and again, patting at the glass and crowing, "Birdie," and "Fluffy," at birds and squirrels and "Woof woof" at dogs being walked along the sidewalk. She was the picture of cheerful innocence, chewing at her thumb and singing along nonsense with the music on the radio. As soon as she was freed from her restraints, Meggie leapt from her car seat onto the driveway and raced across the grass to her front door, just in time for her mommy to open it and nearly be tackled in a hug. Brian hurried to the front door just as quickly as Meggie had, feeling practically naked with his pull-ups showing to anyone passing by on the street. Rachel padded more gingerly into the house, careful not to hurt her tender soles, and upset Sarah had simply packed her shoes and socks away rather than let her put them back on. Inside the house, Brian had stopped to stare slack-jawed at Sue. The teen girl was in an adult-sized version of a baby jumper. It was suspended by elastic straps to the top of the doorway between the living room and dining room. The blue pouch Sue was sat in dangled just high enough so that only the tips of her bare wiggling toes brushed across the floor. As she fidgeted, the elastic bands would stretch and her feet would fall flat on the floor, prompting her to push up, making the pouch she was in bounce up and down. Dressed in nothing but a diaper hidden by the bouncer, she appeared naked, her breasts jiggling as she jumped. "Watch it, Brian, or your face will freeze that way," Rachel warned him. Brian blushed at being caught and pretended to be very interested in the ceiling all of a sudden. Amanda welcomed Sarah into the house and shut the door while Meggie continued to try to hug her tightly around the waist. Okay, honey. Why don't you take your friends out to the yard and play for a bit," she suggested. "Meggie play," the girl agreed, hopping up and down so that the sound echoed through the house. Amanda nodded and commented to Sarah, "She's just getting to the age where she enjoys playing with other children, you know. It really is wonderful." "Oh yes, 21 really is a magic age for little ones, getting used to the potty, playing with other children. It is a great time," Sarah noted. "Okay honey," Amanda told Meggie, "before you play let's get you nice and naked." Meggie chirped. With that, Amanda unzipped Meg's play dress and slipped it down to her ankles, leaving her standing in nothing but her pull-ups. Then with one quick flourish she had those around her ankles as well. Amanda helped her daughter step clear of the piled clothing, leaving her hopping about buck naked singing, "I'm all naked. Naked, naked, naked." Seeing Sarah's confused expression, Amanda explained, "Oh, it's a new thing I'm trying. They call it naked potty training. See, whenever she has something on, even just pull-ups, she thinks it's like a diaper and she just goes. When she's naked she remembers to use the potty and she doesn't lose control while trying to get her clothes off to sit on it. Does it really work? So far, so good. That sounds like something I should try with my little guy. He has a really hard time telling me when he needs to potty," Sarah mused. "Oh, definitely give it a try. It's perfect because you know little kids have no modesty anyway. As you can see, my little Meggie just loves her naked time." What they'd seen before this moment had been bad enough. But to see Megan stark naked in all her glory was beyond the pale. there was their longtime friend and compatriot hopping around totally unclothed and happy as a lark. She wasn't drunk or slutty, she wasn't making lewd gestures for a bunch of frat boys. She was just playing like the innocent toddler she thought she was, and in her new diminished mentality clothing simply got in the way. Meggie had a slender, pretty body. Her small breasts jiggled as she hopped about. Although he tried not to stare, Brian couldn't help but notice that his friend lacked tan lines. Her bared bottom was just as tanned as her arms and legs. It seemed that in this new reality Meggie spent a lot of time nude in the sun, probably playing in the yard, perhaps even at the beach. She really was a silly little nudist now. Sarah and Amanda entered the living room leading the naked woman by her hands. Sarah said to her friend, "Yes, I think now is the perfect time for Brian to have a go at naked potty training himself. If that's okay with you." "Oh, by all means, Meggie would love to have another jaybird to play with," Amanda assured her. "You're sure? You don't mind his pee-pee jiggling around all free?" "Don't be silly, nobody will mind his cute little weenie." But Brian shook his head vigorously. He felt naked in his pull-ups as it was. "I don't wanna go naked," he told them. "Oh, don't be fussy, Brian, Meggie's mommy doesn't mind one bit. It'll be just like at home after bath," his mommy assured. Brian backed away, but there was no escape. Sue was blocking the way to the dining room and the adults were before him. He just kept shaking his head. "Brian, you're just having too many accidents. Now either we try this or we have to go back to deer pies for a bit," Mommy warned. He didn't know why, but that idea actually scared him more. He didn't want to be a baby. Being a toddler was more than bad enough. "No, please. No diapers," he wailed, feeling on the verge of a temper tantrum. Mommy stepped close and pulled her grown boy into a cuddle. "Okay, no diapers," she agreed. Brian let out a sigh of relief. Mommy knew he wasn't a dumb little baby. But just as he felt relieved, cool hands slipped under the bottom of his red t-shirt. The chilly fingers tickled against his sides and then yanked upward, swiftly removing his shirt. A separate set of fingers belonging to Amanda hooked into the sides of his pull-ups and yanked downward at the same time. In a split second he'd been rendered nude. Cool air brushed across his penis. He looked down at it dangling there, flaccid and exposed to everyone in the room. Brian tried to cover himself, but Meggie had already rushed over and seized his hands, hopping about urging, "Pway, wanna pway." Brian nearly broke down into tears right there and then. Rachel could see his defeat and she just couldn't let him be alone like this. He tried to save her back in the potty room after all. Now it was her turn. "Can I go naked too?" she called out. Brian sniffled and looked over at Rachel like she'd grown a second head. "Oh, of course, sweetie," Amanda replied. "I don't think Joy would mind, do you?" she asked Sarah. "No, she won't care. We need to give them a bath later anyway," she agreed. "Okay, honey, let me help you get undressed," Amanda directed. Rachel swallowed her pride and let the woman slip her dress off, feeling a rush of shame as the cool air brushed across her bared breasts. As her pull-ups were slid down her legs and her bottom was exposed to the air as well, she forced herself to look at Brian. He better appreciate what she was doing for him. "Joy never mentioned Rachel being a little nudist like my Meggie," Amanda commented to Sarah. "Well, you know little kids, monkey see, monkey do," Sarah replied. Rachel wanted to slap the woman across the face, but instead she bit the side of her mouth and kept her lips sealed. "There we go, the three little bears." Amanda smirked. Then she gave Meggie a gentle pat on her bare bum. "Okay, on your way, ya little jaybirds." Brian wanted to dig his feet into the carpet and stand his ground, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. With each step the sliding door to the backyard grew closer. The brightness of the sun outside seemed blinding and somehow foreboding. Brian kept shaking his head and mumbling, "No, wanna play inside," to the mothers. "Don't be silly, dear, you need some fresh air," Mommy insisted, following him to the door. Brian blinked in the brightness and cringed as he felt the heat of the sun on his skin, emerging onto the deck. Rough wood gave way to soft grass under his soles and a warm breeze played across his pee-pee and bum as Brian made his way into the yard. He looked about desperately for some type of shelter. There were fences on all sides of the yard, but they weren't high enough to provide real privacy. Houses overlooked it on two sides. An older woman watering plants on her deck next door glanced down at the naked 20-somethings and smiled, giving them a condescending wave. Playing naked outside was downright degrading. Brian felt like a dog put outside because he wasn't housebroken. Meggie didn't mind one little bit, of course. She just ran helter-skelter about the grassy lawn, boobs bouncing free, tumbling and rolling about as if nothing could be more fun. Soon the soles of her feet were brown with dirt, her toes muddy and her knees grass-stained. Twigs and pieces of grass stuck out of her wild hair, and yet she couldn't have smiled and wider. Brian and Rachel sought shelter by the fence, crouching in the small shadow there. "Why'd you do it?" Brian asked. "So you wouldn't be alone," she shrugged. "Well, there was Megan." Rachel shook her head dismissively at their old friend who was chewing on a dandelion and some dirt pulled from the ground. "She doesn't count." "Not anymore." Brian nodded. Sarah appeared on the back deck carrying a pink potty seat. A moment later Amanda came out with a second one, setting it to face the other. "If you need to go potty, they're right here," Sarah told them. "This is so," Brian began. "What?" Rachel asked as he trailed off. Brian grasped his abdomen and looked at her with worry. I think I gotta go." "So, go then." "I won't look." "You heard your mommy, the potty is there." Not pee-pee," he mumbled. "Oh," Rachel nodded. Grunting again, Brian stood and hurried towards the deck, ignoring the feeling of his unhindered pee-pee swishing back and forth between his hairless thighs. His only thought was of making it to that potty in time. He did. Sitting swiftly on the seat and leaning forward to do his business in some sort of privacy. "Oh look Sarah, your little boy is using the potty already," Amanda called from just inside the house. Brian cursed her for calling attention to his predicament. Next thing he knew, his mommy and Sarah were out on the deck smiling down at him. Meggie hurried onto the deck herself and sat on a red plastic pushtrike. Rachel slowly ambled over, covering her breasts and trying not to stare. "Honey, come sit on the potty so you can make too," Amanda called to the girl, taking her hand and leading her reluctantly to the second potty seat. Now he and Rachel were each sat on a potty on the deck, naked in the sun, facing each other while everyone looked on expectantly. Brian tried not to go now. He couldn't do it, not in front of all these people. But his body wasn't cooperating anymore. He felt sudden pressure and pushed in response. It was instinctual and he couldn't stop it after that. Everyone heard the rude noises erupting from the potty, the plop-plop of poopy dropping into it. Brian grunted and strained, just wanting it over with quickly now. As the sounds continued, his mommy knelt beside him, rubbing his bare back and crooning, "Good boy Brian, what a good boy you are, making poopis for mommy." Even Meggie was clapping her hands and feet as she sat on her pushtrike babbling, "Poopy. Poo-poo poo-poo." Even when that humiliation was over, the worst was still to come. Brian had barely finished his business when he found himself being stood up and led over the wall of the house. Mommy took out some wipes and he felt the cool moist things cleaning his bottom. He knew his position was revealing this whole messy ordeal to Rachel and Meggie, but he was powerless to resist. He just stared down at his toes and waited for it to be over. After the cleaning ordeal was over, they were allowed back inside to watch cartoons, while still sat naked on their two potty chairs. As if watching Winnie the Pooh wasn't bad enough, now he wasn't even allowed off his potty seat because he needed to set a good example for Rachel until she could make poopy too. As they sat there in silent humiliation, Sarah strode into the room carrying a pink toddler book. "Hey Amanda, where did you get this book?" she called. It looks really familiar for some reason. The other mother came in from the kitchen and looked it over. Oh yeah, I dunno where it's from. Just found it last night. Why? Well, I'm pretty sure The Catcher in the Rye is one of Brian's books. Brian and Rachel's heads snapped to attention at those words. There was the book. But it didn't look anything like the book they wanted. What had happened to it? Oh, Meggie must have taken it by mistake when they played yesterday. You can take it back, of course. What's it about anyway? That's a funny title. Seems to be about a little rabbit who doesn't want to grow up, she said, flipping through the pages. Oh, I can understand that, Sarah nodded. I mean, just look how much trouble Brian is having learning the potty. Things were so much easier when he was little. I know, Amanda agreed. I wish we could just keep them our little bundles of joy a bit longer. Brian and Rachel's eyes went wide and the whole world seemed to freeze as the book in the mommy's hands began to glow once again.